So once again, I would like to welcome you to our first panel, International Perspectives, Combating Trafficking in Human Beings and All Forms of Sexual Exploitation, Strategies for Destination Countries. As we have heard from our opening remarks and the keynote speakers, it is really key to address issues with regards to demand for sexual exploitation in destination countries, as otherwise we will just be doing the same thing over and over again for many more years and decades as we have been doing. Then I will start with Elisabeth Winkelmeier-Becker, member of the German Parliament, chair of the Legal Committee. Since 2021. She's a member of the German Bundestag since 2005, and from 2014 to 2019, she was the spokesperson for CDU-CSU Parliamentary Group for Law and Consumer Protection. In 2019, she became the Parliamentary State Secretary at the Federal Ministry for Economic Affairs and Energy in Germany, a role that she served in until 2021.
Ja, sehr gerne übernehme ich hier
I'm very happy to give a small kick-off presentation on this important topic. I will do this in German, so please switch languages. I would like to welcome you all here at the CAS in Berlin and with IJM. Great partnership, great cooperation. And I would also like to say hello to everyone present online to take part in this talk about an important topic. So we're going to talk about the legal situation and the impact of national legislation on the situation of human trafficking, and in this case especially sexual exploitation. I can report on the situation in Germany, and it's not that easy because it's not a good example when we compare Germany to other countries. The legal situation does make a difference. We can see this especially in comparison with other countries that follow the Nordic model. Sweden was the first country to establish the Nordic model, and a first evaluation showed that this legal change brought about significant change with regard to the demand and the extent of prostitution, as well as the social perspective on prostitution. The same was true for France when they changed a few years ago. Israel also moved towards the Nordic model, and we'll hear more about that in a bit. In Germany, however, the other extreme is true, or legally enshrined. Germany pretends that prostitution was sort of a normal job, sort of, because there were certain limitations. In 2016, they were decided upon, have been in force for about 5 years. And before, I would say the basic idea was it's a normal job that you had to register for. It was an insurable employment, or it was thought to be insurable employment, but that is not the case in practice. We have about 400,000 so-called providers, almost exclusively women. There are some men and trans persons offering sexual services, but I would like to focus on the situation of women registered, in the sense that I work in prostitution as a registered job is about 40,000, small number. The numbers are hard to validate, but you can say round about 10%. And those registered for insurable employment, well, that's a 2-digit number, less than 100 persons. Again, the numbers are so insignificant, it really doesn't matter whether it's a few more or less. We have to admit the concept back then has failed. Therefore, a few years ago, efforts were made to improve the situation at least a bit. But again, that more or less didn't show results. The idea was that a registration was to be made mandatory, and the expectation was that the respective registration office would get in touch with a person registering to work as a prostitute and then ask them critically, do you really want to do this? Why are you doing this? Is there someone who's telling you that you owe them something, that you have debts? You have to pay for travel costs, for example. Do you know what you're in for? Have you got your own passport? These were the questions to be asked, and then in case of doubt, investigations were supposed to be carried out, but we must say this wasn't showing great effect. The situation for the majority of those working in prostitution is unbearable. I told you about the numbers. 80 of 90% of all those persons, we assume that there is a forced situation or at least some kind of cheat, deceit, or later on then violence and threat. And the reality for many is that there are sexual attacks by sex buyers, punters, johns, without having a choice, without being able to say no, having to suffer it all. This is what we heard from survivors, from investigators. And these are acts that you cannot really imagine without taking into consideration disgust, pain, or free will. The corona pandemic has shown that we are often under an illusion when we think about the image of a job where we work so and so many hours a day and then return to our bourgeois existence. And that is not the case when we talk about prostitution. There often is no private flat to return to. There is no account. There is no medical insurance. Nothing that would remind us of a normal profession. Quite the contrary. This legal regulation makes it more difficult to shed light on the background, for under the guise or under the cloak of legality, there is so much room for a market, because it's so difficult for investigators to unveil criminal acts, because everything is seemingly normal and seemingly legal. It is very complicated for investigators to get to the bottom of the matter. But if you were to really use a lot of resources and really try to get to the bottom of a case, then you will find that even someone like Rodloff, talking about his showcase brothel paradise, even he was in the end proven to be involved in human trafficking. And I think small changes in the system are not going to lead to changes. What we need is a paradigm change. I therefore advocate, together with colleagues from my party and other parties in the German parliament, I advocate for a change towards the Nordic model in Germany. What we need is a societal debate, because we can see this has taken on a dimension that affects all of society. The image of women is impaired. The ability to actually establish a relationship, especially on the side of men, but also between men and women, is impaired. A man who's gone to have a blow job in a brothel during his lunch break will not look at his female colleagues or boss with respect afterwards. And this is going to impact young women as well. Everyone is confronted with it, with what is seemingly normal. And I think the tearing apart of sex on the one hand and relationship on the other is doing harm to all of us. And it cheats us all out of this beautiful experience that both can go together and should go together, and therefore it really harms us all. Girls only have the choice to be either hot or invisible. Either you play along or you keep out of everything, and then you don't have access to a normal and a free partnership. Well, this applies to a lot of people at least, and makes things so difficult. So why didn't we establish the Nordic model just yet? There is a very strong prostitution lobby that's very active, also in the parliaments of the Länder, and everywhere at all levels, really. There is the original feminist attitude, those who 20 years ago advocated for this normality are now finding it really hard to admit that they failed, that it was a mistake, and that makes things very difficult. So I think we do need a new discussion that says, also a young discussion led by young women that say, we don't want to live like that. We need new men. We need a new attitude in men. And the men also need to say that they distance themselves from that, saying, well, we want sexuality to happen in a partnership, and we don't want to treat women as a commodity, because this is not what we understand by human dignity and gender equality. So much from my part for now. I'm looking forward to the other presentations. Thank you.
Thank you so much for pointing out the importance of building an equal society. And this is where what has been initially called the Nordic model, the Swedish model, the French model is now called the equality model by most. So, thank you for pointing out the society we want to live in, and, the society that our daughters, and our sisters and wives and mothers should actually inhabit, where their abuse and exploitation should not be thought of as a regular job, something that's based on demand of specifically men who think it is their right and opportunity and ability to just go out there and purchase any woman at any time. So thank you very much for pointing that out. I think we are still having a technical issue with Ambassador Ekstedt. But before we move on, I would like to tell the audience online that they're welcome to post questions in the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen, and we will try to address those to the speakers once everybody is done presenting. With that, actually, I would like to invite Mr. Eddie Mujaj, who's the Senior Advisor for the Task Force Against Trafficking in Human Beings at the Council of the Baltic Sea States, where he has worked in this area for almost 10 years. Previously to working for the council, Eddie served and here's another Swedish word, so I've mispronounced the Finnish and the French already. Länsstyrelsen, Stockholm.
Very good.
Working with the National Coordinator's Office Against Prostitution and Trafficking. So the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Good evening, everyone. Thank you for involving the Council of the Baltic Sea States in this conference today, and especially our unit, the Task Force Against Trafficking in Human Beings. Very shortly, we are an international organization and a sort of political forum with 10 member states located in Stockholm, and we cooperate on different issues affecting the Baltic Sea region and its citizens, and one of those issues is trafficking in human beings. I'm also particularly happy to be in Berlin because in just a few months, the German Ministry of Foreign Affairs will take over the presidency of organization from Norway that currently holds it. So I'm very happy to be here. And before I start my intervention, thank you to the Konrad Adenauer Stiftung and especially to ODIHR, because we have seen through the years ODIHR taking a very comprehensive, but also more than anything, a much needed approach when it comes to highlighting the issues of gender and demand in the context of human trafficking. So thank you a lot for that. Several speakers today have already established that the horrors taking place in light of the Russian war against Ukraine. And sadly, we are yet to see the end of this. And although us, the states receiving refugees and the migrants coming at the moment, need to have a long-term approach because this will be a long battle. This will not end soon. And although we should not be, or we should avoid being sensationalist and starting to see, human trafficking everywhere, we do see very clear indications and signs in our region already of human trafficking increasing, especially when it comes to Ukrainian women and children being exploited. I think of one example from Sweden, which is very alarming and very recent, I would say. In the Stockholm area, only during the month of March, only in a specific police raid, 38 Swedish men were identified for purchasing sexual services. Of those women victimized in this prostitution, 31 were Ukrainian women, which is remarkable in many ways, but it's remarkable because this is a new development in Sweden. Ukrainian women have, until that point, not been the majority of women exploited in prostitution. And we also see examples of, in Lithuania, where a prosecutor very recently initiated a preliminary investigation looking into a case with over 40 orphanage children from Ukraine suspected to be subjected to illegal adoption, which is also a very serious potential exploitation form. So Ukrainian children from orphanage homes are taken to our member states, and people and organizations take the opportunity to adopt them, in this case, to Western countries. And when reading and hearing about these examples, I mean, I worked with trafficking issues for 8-9 years. My first reaction is that, I have no words for this. This is so cynical for men, usually, taking the opportunity to, they read the same news and, stories as we do with women and children fleeing Ukraine. Yet they are at any point ready to, exploit these women and purchase their bodies, to meet their own needs. But when I think like that, I become guilty of a mistake that we do very often, and that is limit ourselves to saying, I have no words, this is an evil act, there's nothing we can do about this. But this is the exact problem. I think we need to find the words for this and call it for what it is. And that's the issue of demand, which I'm very glad, is being highlighted today. Because we know that demand is the factor that fuels human trafficking. And again, with the situation of Ukraine, we also see that we have organized crime groups ready at any point, and actually quite, with sophisticated organizations that they have and possess, to always supply the market, in this case, men wishing to purchase the bodies of women, and basically meet their needs. I also want to add that we see something in the context of demand, which is a bit worrying, which is also, more broadly speaking. In the Council of the Baltic Sea States, we finalized a 2-year project looking into how media and journalism cover the topic of human trafficking in our member states. It was a very interesting project where we had over 600 journalist students, teachers, and established journalists who are experienced in covering trafficking in human beings. And we saw some quite interesting changes in our region when it comes to how media portrays human trafficking. And I think the first big change was trafficking has gone from being portrayed as an issue of human rights where the journalists more often previously would go to women's shelters and NGOs to kind of get the main information and have them being the main source in the articles and the stories, to human trafficking going has gone to become more of a security issue and a border issue, where law enforcement is very often the first point of contact. And that's, there's nothing wrong with interviewing law enforcement. They have a very important role when it comes to anti-trafficking work, but they do not assist the victims. There are other actors that do that. But what we also see is that the issue of demand is basically non-existing in the media coverage. Very often stories look, even in those stories where they actually interview the exploited victim herself, they might ask questions such as, how come you were tricked? Why were you tricked? Like which strategies and which motives was applied in order for, to get you to Europe. But very rarely the articles pose a question, who are, and I'm sorry to use this expression, who are the end users of this woman? Why is she here? What's the overall purpose of her being here? And that's men in our member states, in our territories, exploiting these women. Just as a final remark, we also heard about the Nordic model here, which is, the legislation in Sweden and Norway and many other countries at the moment. But I also want to highlight that there is something extremely destructive in the fact that in all member states of our organization, meaning in all the Baltic Sea region today, women exploited in prostitution are systematically reported if they are identified by law enforcement and do not have, so to speak, a legal stay in Sweden or Germany and so on. And I really want to, although we need to speak about demand and the legislation kind of opportunities there are to mitigate or address demand, we also need to speak about this, that very exploited women exploited by our citizens are deported, and this takes place in countries such as Germany, where purchasing sexual services is in fact legalized, but also in countries such as Sweden, where it is prohibited to purchase sexual services. Thank you very much. I'll stop there.
Thank you so much for that remark. I would like to actually refer to one of our keynote speakers, Johan, who has actually talked about the non-punishment principle and not punishing the victims of sexual exploitation and sex trafficking for what has been done to them. So that goes very much alongside this. But I'd also like to actually mention something interesting, right? Where with the war in Ukraine starting, some of the largest searches online were for Ukrainian women and sex, Ukrainian sex slaves, and pornography produced of rapes of Ukrainian women. That's the big thing on porn sites now, pornography produced of Ukrainian women being raped. So this is just something that gives us a particular lens on society we live in, that instead of looking at how can we assist and protect, we have a situation where we have a lot of men thinking, okay, now I have access to more bodies of highly vulnerable women and children. And that brings us back to the conversation on demand and how we change our society. With that, actually, I would like to introduce our next speaker, Kevin Hyland, who is a member of Council of Europe, group of experts on action against trafficking in human beings. During a 30-year policing career, Kevin Hyland specialized in investigating serious organized crime, including homicide, sexual offenses, corruption, and headed London's internationally recognized human trafficking unit in 2014. He was appointed the UK's first independent anti-slavery commissioner, and in 2015 was awarded an OBE for his work fighting human trafficking. In 2018, he was the co-recipient of the Path for Peace Award in New York. He's a trustee to both Europe's largest homeless charity, The Passage, and Rahab, who supported trafficked and exploited women and girls in London. He had several international anti-trafficking projects, chairing the Responsible Recruitment Group of the Institute of Human Rights and Business, chairing the Island of Ireland Human Trafficking Project, advisor to the US-based Global Fund to End Modern Slavery, and leads the OSCE development of victim support guidance for member state. And I could add, significantly more, but I'll also mention that he is one of the founders of the Santa Marta Group, which teams up faith-based efforts and law enforcement actually to have more impact. And he has been a great contributor to the work of OSCE ODIHR. And with that, Kevin, I would like to hand over to you.
So thank you very much, Tatiana, and thank you to the Konrad Adenauer Foundation for organizing this event. But can I make a particular thanks to Atahan and to Leopoldine and to Mr. Kuliba for their presentations today. Your stories are more important and are the reality. But I think, as Atahan mentioned, we now have more international commitment on this through the UN Palermo Protocol, Council of Europe Convention, EU directives, many national pieces of legislation. We have a global commitment through the UN General Assembly. We have the Five Eyes Nations commitment. We have the commitment of the G20. And yet we still see this abuse of women, children, and men increase. And we see those who are earning from this profiting to 150 billion US dollars a year, which is a very conservative estimate, which was evaluated in 2014. And we see the numbers of victims identified around 110,000 a year, with the estimated numbers being 40 million. So less than a fraction of 1%. And then we see the amount of people who get prosecuted declining significantly, not because of COVID, because it was prior to COVID, we saw that happening. About 4 or 5 years ago, it was about 17,000 a year to 9,000 last year. So whilst we have greater, perhaps, interest, we have less impact. And I think Mr. Heimalski mentioned a national action plan, which I think is what is required. And he also spoke of national referral mechanisms, which are also required. But national referral mechanisms, which come out of the Council of Europe Convention model, there's not one in the Council of Europe country or anywhere that really meets the standards of what an NRM is about. And I know tomorrow Tatiana will be talking about the guidance that the OSCE and ODIHR have produced. But an NRM is supposed to be proactive. It's supposed to be the state's responsibility for identifying victims, suppressing this crime. It's not about responding after it happens. It's supposed to be a place where people are identified, supported, and given pathways, even when they don't want it. And how that works takes a lot of sophistication. For example, some of the groups I work with in London will take many months or many years to assist someone to realize that they are being exploited through education, through support. Women may not realize that there is a better opportunity, particularly when the state's opportunity, as we heard, might be if you come forward, you're going to be deported. But then if we look at the international level, how much money is spent on this crime? If we look at investments into drugs, gun crime, terrorism, we are talking about hundreds of billions a year. If we look at trafficking, we are lucky if we reach 1 billion a year across the world by governments. And yet the traffickers are earning 150 billion US dollars a year. Therefore, it's an unfair fight, and one side is winning. And until policies are designed to strip those assets, to make anything where you profit from trafficking, where money is tainted, is taken away from you, then this is something worth doing. If somebody can recruit a handful of women and become a millionaire, and the chances of being prosecuted are less than 0.2%, so there's a 99.98% chance that you're going to get away with it, and the victims aren't going to be supported because they may be deported, then it's a good crime to be involved in. And the policies need to change. We also need to recognise, as we heard from our speakers earlier, this is one of the most serious violations of human rights. Not just because of the crime that it is, but also it targets the most vulnerable in our society. We see that in Ukraine at the moment. People quickly move, but then governments move slowly. We're still discussing responses that are weak on the ground in the borders in Poland, Hungary, Romania, or in receiving countries like my country, Ireland, or the UK, or here in Germany. Yet, all the criminals have to do is drive to the border with a big car and then drive back somewhere else. And responses take months and sometimes years. The criminals only have a car and perhaps a few €1,000. Governments have billions. We're in the third richest country in the world here, and yet responses remain weak. So countries and governments need to own up and accept their responsibility. When I look at countries, say at the UN or recently at meetings I've been to, where they're congratulating themselves for helping people from Ukraine, this is a duty. This is something we agreed at the UN. This is the commitments about human rights. It's just the same as helping anyone who's in need. Yet countries move to the point where they're congratulating themselves when they haven't even written a policy, when people are still being lost in the system. We heard the stories in Ukraine where children and women are being raped, being run over by tanks. And yet we're already congratulating on ourselves for receiving a number of people. Well, let's put the congratulations to one side. Let's put our shoulder to the wheel. Let's start to make things happen. Let's start to ask our politicians what they are doing with our taxpayers' money. They have our money, not the other way round. Democracy is something that we all cherish. And we see what happens when democracy is taken away. But let's remind politicians, governments, that democracy means that we have committed at the UN, at the EU, at the Council of Europe, that we will do whatever is needed to help people who end up in trauma and traumatized and exploited. So let's go away and learn and look at, say, the reports that come out of the Council of Europe about our states and how poorly or how good we are doing. I don't know one country that really looks like it's doing a good job on human trafficking. Because as we hear, victims still get deported, women get lost in the system. The UK, that talks about a good NRM system, has people waiting up to 3 or 4 years for a decision. The waiting list is about 30,000 people, 3 times the annual number that enter it. Can you imagine any other crime in the world where if you were a victim, it took 3 years for the state to decide if you were a victim or not? If somebody was the victim of an assault or a sexual assault, or your house was broken in and you were told, we'll come back to you in a few years and let you know, we'd be outraged. So let's bring that outrage into the policy. Let's look at policies that work. Let's start looking at things that can deliver. And let's start looking at taking away the cash from the traffickers. There is lots of legislation, like the CBP Act in the US, the UK Modern Slavery Act, the Australian Modern Slavery Act, the French Due Diligence Act, and the EU Directive on conflict minerals. Yet, only last year, when the US and Canada, as a policy decision, decided not to buy public protective equipment from Malaysia because of child labour, the UK continued to buy it and spent hundreds of millions on goods that were taken from children being exploited. And that then kept those exploited children in the business of child labour. So how can the UK say it's acting against this crime when it's actually funding it? Now, Germany, as we know, is bringing in new legislation next year, which will be the first country in the world with a sanction to businesses that benefit from human trafficking. At the moment, if I committed a Data Protection Act or a company committed a Data Protection Act, they would be fined in the millions because they let our data out. If there is a breach of environment, there is fines, quite rightly. If somebody makes a mistake in a car manufacturer, the cars are recalled and there can be a fine. But if you keep people in trafficking and you make millions a year out of it, then all you do is create some sort of partnership. As I heard recently, have a lunch and learn session, do some posters, and that's seen as being enough. But we need to change that. We need to change it, that this is a crime that you cannot profit from. And all that profit, if we can create a way of tainting it, then goes to support people who need that money so that people can then actually see this is something not worth doing. But if you are unfortunate to be caught in this crime, you will be supported properly and efficiently. And you won't get nations running around patting themselves on the back when actually they are the countries or the funds that are allowing this to happen. So we need some honesty, transparency. And we saw that this morning in our speeches. We saw the humility of a survivor of this crime, who I think spoke about what a global strategy should look like. And I think her clarity that comes clearly from her heart, but also from her experience, is something that we should take on Mr. Hamoski's example of introducing national action plans and a national referral mechanism. So thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Kevin, for calling our governments to responsibility on issues with regards to demand, whether it is for trafficking for labor exploitation, but also on trafficking for sexual exploitation. Because we cannot say, when we know and we have reports, and I'm sure we're going to hear in the following presentations of what actually happens in the sex industry, that there are no trafficking victims there, that everything is as it should be. There are national referral mechanisms and the updated guidance from OSCE ODIHR, to which you greatly contributed, that is available online for all of you and hopefully in print very shortly in a number of different languages. And many of the participants here participated in creating this guidance, and especially the survivor leaders on, whose faces actually are on the cover of the book, and, who are actually, whose guidance is actually reflected throughout the book as well, because it is important for us to act now, and to act within a certain set of standards, not to just say we're doing something. With that, I would like to introduce Johan Büser, member of the Swedish Parliament, Rapporteur of the Committee on Democracy, Human Rights and Humanitarian Issues at the OSCE Parliamentary Assembly. And as Ambassador Ekstedt is not able to join us for technical reasons, we'll also speak a bit on the Swedish model as well. He was the participant in the OSCE PA election observation missions to the United States, Kazakhstan, Ukraine, Kyrgyzstan, Albania, Armenia, and Uzbekistan. The floor is yours.
Thank you so much for that introduction, and dear members of parliament, honorable representatives, as well as distinguished experts and advisors. I would like to start by saying that I'm happy to be invited by the Konrad Adenauer Stiftung, and it's my second time in this year as visiting the Konrad Adenauer Stiftung, being a rapporteur of the OSCE as well. But as you also pointed out, I'm also a member of the Swedish Parliament since the year of 2014. And before that, I was also a youth politician for a couple of years. And I already noticed that we have made several references both to the Swedish perspective and also to the Nordic model. And it makes me happy, is not the right word maybe to use, but I think it's very good that we see now new countries shifting to what we call the Nordic model. I see on the screen there that we will later on speak about the Israeli route to the Nordic model. And also from what I've heard from my colleague from Germany makes me also glad to hear, actually, because when I was a youth politician, I went to a panel like this at a youth camp, summer youth camp, and I had a debate on, and the law at the moment in Sweden was newly established, and there was quite a, not a chaotic debate, but there was very much strong feelings. I was the only male in that debate, and there was a woman from Germany, a panelist, and she called herself very strong feminist. But when I told her about this Nordic model, the new inaugurated law in Sweden, not to punish the women and to punish the ones who are buying and exploiting women and children as well. She was really angry and said, "So you mean you don't have this problem in Sweden? You're just hiding your problems," and so on. So we had that kind of debate, and then I'm very happy that you also pointed out, Mr. Mujaj, that there is also a problem throughout the whole Nordic-Baltic region, which there of course is, but it's of course our commitments that are really, really important, what we do as politicians, and to see what you also said about the commitments to fight prostitution and fight exploitation of women, children, and also other crimes regarding to the trafficking situation. So I think that is really, really important. I would also try, of course, to speak a little bit out from an OSCE perspective, and it's impossible not to mention what is going on at the moment regarding the Russia-Ukraine, because as we heard before, many Ukrainian refugees are coming to our countries, also to Sweden, of course. Myself, I have friends who are my closest friends. They're actually taking care of a Ukrainian mother and her 2 daughters, and they live in their home, and this is the situation in many countries where we want to help a lot. Myself, I visited the Polish-Ukrainian border a couple of weeks ago, and it's so difficult to understand and hard to believe that the Polish society has taken more than 2 million refugees since the 24th of February, and that is really so hard to understand that we have this situation in our close region, so to speak. But the Russian invasion of Ukraine is the greatest violation of the European society order, which we have seen in modern time, and since also the foundation of the OSCE organization, I would say. And whereas the political implications can be calculated, the human distress, of course, is immeasurable in this perspective. We all see the headlines after headlines. There are headlines about the Third World War. There are headlines about new bombs, new attacks on civilians, on hospitals, and so on. But we also learn about the cruel and systematic outrage committed in Ukraine by the Russian war machine, because it is a war machine and it is a breach towards the international law, and that is really important to say. At the same time, the grave vulnerability of displaced individuals has not made the same impact on the headlines, and that is also something which I think is important to stress. The misery of war, it spreads quickly and adversely affects all aspects of the human well-being, far beyond the battlefield. And by now, the brutal Russian invasion has forcibly displaced over 5 million people. Given that the majority of those, as we said before, are women and children, and the risks of trafficking cannot be understated. And I would like to quote a statement which was made on the 12th of April. It was made by Gillian Triggs, and the Assistant High Commissioner for Protection with UNHCR, the UN Refugee Agency, and he stated that while the generosity and solidarity towards Ukrainian refugees has been inspiring, states must prevent predatory individuals and criminal networks from exploiting the situation. And Ms. Triggs noted that UNHCR is on high alert and warning refugees on the risks of predators and criminal networks who may attempt to exploit the vulnerability or lure them with promises of free transport, accommodation, employment, or other forms of assistance. It is distressing to hear more and more concerning reports on the situation of Ukrainian refugees. And just to mention, in my own country, in Stockholm, the police has launched at least 6 preliminary inquiries of crimes against the Ukrainian refugees. The mass displacement following Russia's boundless aggression puts the capacity of European anti-trafficking measures to the test. And with the brutal invasion of Ukraine, we are faced with a human tragedy of epic proportions in the heart of Europe. But the neglect of severe humanitarian situations has been long ongoing. That is something that we know. And around the European Union lies a ring of unresolved conflicts and unattended humanitarian challenges. This is reflected in the fact that half of trafficking victims are non-European Union citizens as well. And as the OSCE encompasses the wider neighborhood of Europe, the organization is vital in achieving effective preventive and responsive actions. The OSCE is the most comprehensive forum of dialogue on the security of Europe. And while the European security architecture is under its greatest pressure in decades, we also strive to safeguard at its most fundamental human level. The Parliamentary Assembly of the OSCE enables well-founded and resolute action in our common interest. The OSCE Parliamentary Assembly, which I represent, has long been engaged with work in the field of anti-trafficking, thanks largely to the tireless efforts of Congressman Chris Smith. This is always high on our agenda in the OSCE, and I can assure you the steadfast support of parliamentarians from across the OSCE region on this topic. And as a rapporteur of the OSCE Third Committee, and it's the Committee on Democracy, Human Rights and Humanitarian Questions, I am about to deliver a report to our upcoming summer meeting, which will be held in July in Birmingham, where parliamentarians from all the 57 member states will meet, and we will discuss different aspects of security issues. And one of them is, of course, humanitarian rights, which we already discussed that this is what it is about. And of course, it's not impossible not to mention in this report and to give a large section of this report about the ongoing situation and suffering in Ukraine. So that is really worth mentioning, and also the risk for trafficking within our region and in our member states and within the member states of the OSCE. So with an inconceivable war in Europe, our efforts to uphold fundamental human rights have never been as important. In the face of a great upheaval, we stand firm in the conviction to ensure human dignity for all. It is my privilege to take part in this Konrad Adenauer Stiftung conference and be informed by other politicians, by NGOs, research institutes, as well as international organizations. I'm assured in the prospects of our collective effort, and I'm of course looking forward to hear more about your thoughts on the Nordic model and how we can find more legislation and to take this fight together, because it is about basic human rights, and we all need to stand united in this fight. Thank you.
Thank you so much, and I hope you can take some of the messages that you've heard here today to the OSCE Parliamentary Assembly this summer, because I think they're truly important ones. You've heard messages from survivor leaders, you've heard messages from those working on the ground in Ukraine, you've heard messages from other parliamentary members and representative of Council of Europe, GRETA. And now I think I'd like to hand over to Luba Fein, who is going to actually discuss the Israeli route to the Nordic model with you. She's a feminist, abolitionist activist, and sex trade policy lead. She actively promoted the Nordic model in Israel, where the sex purchase ban was enforced 2 years ago. Luba is also a member of the Women's Organization Coalition Against Prostitution and Trafficking in Israel, and a volunteer in FILIA, a women-led volunteer organization and part of the women's liberation movement. She has currently been involved in FILIA podcasts. Her series Listen to Survivors is a platform for the sex trade survivors from all over the world. So handing over to you, and if the presentation can be turned on. Yep, it's on.
How do I move it?
Yeah.
Back and forth.
I guess here.
Just a moment, let's see. Oh, good. This is back. Okay. Thank you. I'm Luba Fein, a sex trade abolitionist from Israel, the 8th Nordic model country. I'd like to talk today about our abolition struggle and how our knowledge and experience can contribute to the same struggle here in Germany. So now, historical context of the sex purchase ban in Israel. Israeli abolitionism began as a fight of a handful of women against the sex trafficking epidemic in Israel. In Eastern Europe, there was significant economic and political instability during the 90s. Many countries there have become the main source of the sex trafficking. Traffickers preyed upon and deceived the women from that area by promising them fair jobs in Israel. Then they smuggled those women illegally to Israel via the Egyptian border. And in Israel, the women became captives of pimps. The criminals confiscated the women's passports, they locked them in the brothels, threatened to kill their families. Some women were forced to accept up to 30 men, rapists per day. This is our past. I wish I could proudly say now that the Israeli society immediately recognized the problem and tackled it efficiently, but sadly not. The authorities, the lawmakers, the media, police ignored the problem. It was ignored for quite long. Only in 2000, in the year 2000, the former MP Zehava Gal'on has founded the Parliamentary Inquiry Committee to fight against the sex trafficking. With this inquiry committee, a coalition of activists, aid workers, members of parliament, journalists, was founded to fight the sex trafficking together. And what is interesting, that the same coalition framework, not with the same members, not a single member has stayed there, but the same coalition is active in Israel now. Since 2013, it's ceased being exclusively left-wing. We broadened this coalition, and today it includes representatives from all political parties. And it was not easy, but it was possible, because human dignity and non-violence, they're not left or right principles, they're universal. In 2008, after significant achievements in the anti-trafficking struggle, the MP Zehava Gal'on proposed a sex purchase ban bill for the first time. After numerous changes in the content of the bill and the list of its supporters, the Israeli lawmakers eventually outlawed the purchase of sex in 2018. The enforcement was planned to stay later to allow us to broaden the already existing exit services. So what happened during the, I think never mind. During the 11 years between 2008, when the bill was proposed, and 2018, when the bill passed, what happened during this 11 years? We promoted the intermediate goals. We realized that the law itself was not feasible yet, but I will give you some examples of what we did in the middle. In 2015, the war against strip clubs has started. A precedent court ruling from 2017 stated that the lap dance equals prostitution services. The ruling by the state attorney seconded that later. After several failed attempts to operate the strip clubs as dance only, local authorities closed those strip clubs completely. One more example. In 2017, we adopted a law banning websites that conduct illegal activity. This law applies to virtual brothels as well. Now, this law did not provoke riots similar to the Nordic model, but its importance is not less. In the era of online prostitution, it is very important to be able to shut those websites. And now, my favorite example of what we did in the middle. The authorities have been funding our exit services since 2008, long before the sex purchase ban passed. Since then, new services have been added every year, and the budget has gradually increased, with the most significant increase under the sex purchase ban in 2018. So today we have here you can see in my PowerPoint the list of main services. We have emergency centers for teens, care centers for adult women, long-term care hostels, emergency apartments, day centers, counseling centers, vocabulary training, mobile clinics, all for survivors of prostitution and women currently in prostitution. The most popular services include the emergency assistance. Emergency assistance such as food and clothing, emergency accommodation, mentoring, trauma-focused care, individual and group therapy, legal counseling, vocational training, and exercise and social rights, among many other services. Of course, we are still facing a myriad of challenges and obstacles. As the public debate concerning prostitution as violence intensifies, more and more women are motivated to turn into aid organizations. So those organizations run out of budgets and infrastructure. And we should, all the time, we have to seek more budgets. And even enforcement is still not sufficient. In the first year of actual law enforcement, the police distributed only 2,000 fines, 2,000. But despite this, we are already seeing the first effects of the law. Yes, the first effects of the law on public opinion and behavior. According to the preliminary data from the research team that accompanies the enforcement of the sex purchase ban, since the law was enacted, 18% of the sex buyers testified that they stopped paying for sex. This is not enough. This number should be 100%, right? But nevertheless, this decrease is significant, because we're speaking only about 6 months after the law was enforced. And more optimistic data, 71% of the public support the sex purchase ban now. Yeah, this is the same public that called us crazy, man haters, fanatics, only 10 years ago. And now they support us. That means we have a lot of hope. Now, how all of this can help Germany in its own fierce battle. Now, it turns out that Germany also deals with the sex trafficking problem. In January 2021 was published a report by an ex-officer, Helmut Sporer, a specialist in prostitution and human trafficking in Germany. And as many of you already know, the report showed a bleak picture. For example, Sporer wrote that most women in prostitution are there against their will. The report also stated that there is no reason to fear the development of underground sex trade in Germany as a consequence of the Nordic model, because there is already underground sex trade in the formal prostitution establishments. And now, due to the war in Ukraine, Europe is flooded with young refugee women, and hence the exploitation of desperate women might increase and worsen. Similar to Israel in the late 90s, an alarm clock is currently ringing for Germany. And the status of Israel in Germany is indeed different. In Israel, the sex trade has never been legalized, and we had no open borders with poorer countries. But Germany also has advantages: a robust welfare system, efficiency, and the proximity to Nordic model countries that allows for cooperation. Of course, your path to success is still rocky, long and hard, and so is ours. But the bell has already rung, and you know what they say: you cannot unring it. Implementation, the Nordic model in this country, will cause a vast global change. And with these amazing people that I see here, the abolitionists, activists, sex trade survivor leaders, members of parliament, I know that you can lead this change. Thank you.
I think we have done actually our round now, from starting with Germany to concluding with Germany, through now the route of also the example of Israel and the journey of change, actually social change, which resulted from the change of legislation and policy. And I've personally visited Israel a number of times actually since this change, and I've seen even the difference on the street in red light districts and such, or what was formerly red light districts. You barely actually see the issue. And I congratulate you for all of your work actually in Israel in making that change. And with that, actually, I would like to open the floor to questions from the audience here. And I will also pose some questions from our audience online in addition. So if you have a question to any of the panelist members here, please raise your hand and a microphone will be provided to you. If there are no questions here, actually, I will actually ask a question of all of the panelists. What I would like to ask you is the following. We are all sitting here in Germany. We do understand that Germany is a destination country for sex trafficking victims. And we're all coming from different perspectives here, from the governmental perspective, intergovernmental organization perspective, civil society perspective, and also another intergovernmental perspective. So different countries, different perspectives. You know, what would you advise actually in terms of policy and law change in Germany to address the demand for sex trafficking here, as well as the flow of sex trafficking victims to Germany? And if maybe, should we start with the left side, Kevin?
So I think that the policy should be broad. It should look at a number of issues. First of all, the vulnerability and the demand, which we've heard quite a detail here on. But I think also it needs to look at the finances that are generated. The reason why people traffic is for money. So how do we manage to stop that and make that something that people don't want to do? And how do we take that money and give that money back, reparation to the victims? We also need to make sure that the policies have non-punishment principles, so that, you know, countries can't find a way to punish the people, for example, deport them. For example, if they commit document offences because of their trafficking, that they're dealt with for some other crime that they've dealt with. I, as a police officer, made sure that any victims of trafficking we dealt with were not prosecuted. That was a challenge because others would disagree with me, but thankfully I was in charge and that was what would happen, even when prosecutors disagreed with me. So there are ways that the policies need to be seen as being supportive to the victim and also challenging to the person who wants to commit this crime. But one of the most important things is they have to be proactive. They have to be funded properly so that when operations, whether it's civil society, whether it's healthcare, whether it's education, these are become part of the business as usual of the state, and responses are properly funded. Because if there isn't the funding there, if it isn't built into the system and the business as usual, it will fall off after funding runs out or after the interest runs out. And that's one of the biggest problems with so much around the human trafficking agenda, is everything's short term, everything's funded either through an EU project or some small project that's there, when we know this is a crime that's been around for years and years and is going to be around for a long time. So crimes need to be trauma informed, looking at vulnerability, how they approach the criminality or the causes, and then also working with countries of source, particularly if you're looking at international development budgets. And obviously Germany is a big player in that. How can it look at how its international budget can actually start to stem things at source through education, through creating more human rights, through better democracy, through influencing policy in source countries, which I know in Nigeria we worked on extensively. And we've now seen prosecutions in Edo State where there'd been no budgets, no funding, no processes. And the first conviction we managed to see there through a collaborative work was of a judge in Edo State, which I'm sure you'd be able to say would never have happened 5 years ago because nobody would go near a judge.
Thank you so much, Kevin. And if I could pass the floor to you, Elisabeth.
Ja, ich denke, das Ziel, der
think
Königsweg wird
the
sein, dass wir
panacea,
weiter
the ideal
dafür
solution will
kämpfen, das
be
nordische Modell
to fight
einzuführen.
for establishing
Und
the
dafür brauchen
Nordic
wir
model. To do
ein
that,
geändertes
we
Narrativ
need
in der Gesellschaft. Denn
to
wie
change the
gesagt, es gibt
narrative
zum
in
einen das
society.
Narrativ der
On the one hand, there is
Prostitutionslobby,
the
die sehr
narrative
stark
of the
darauf abstellt, auf
prostitution
die
lobby
vielleicht kleinen Prozentzahlen
that
von Anbietern, die es
aims at
wirklich
the
freiwillig
small
und selbstbestimmt
percentage
machen und damit
of
natürlich auch auf einer ganz anderen Ebene, mit einer ganz
providers
anderen
offering
Praxis
services
sozusagen
voluntarily,
ihre Berufung ausüben, wenn ich mal so in
thus
Anführungszeichen sprechen darf.
exercising
Es fällt
their
übrigens auf, dass
calling,
viele
in
Aktivistinnen
parentheses,
auf der
in a very
Seite
different way. And
eben nicht
a lot of
diese
activists on
geschilderten
that side
typischen
do
Schicksale
not
erleiden, sondern zum Beispiel als Dominas
suffer
unterwegs sind und dann meinen,
the
sie könnten
typical
über
fates, but rather
Prostitution
maybe they
reden.
are,
Ja, also eine
they
ganz,
work
ganz
it
andere
as a
Situation.
dominatrix, and then they think they can talk about
Wir müssen
the situation in
denen, die
general.
es aus einer feministischen Haltung
Those
heraus
who, from a feminist point of view,
befürwortet haben, zu der Situation zu kommen, oder zu der Gesetzeslage zu
the
kommen,
current
die wir jetzt haben,
legislation,
denen müssen wir sagen, es ist ein sehr überraschendes Ergebnis
must be
von
told,
Feminismus,
well, this is a
wenn
very
jetzt
surprising
junge
result of
Frauen
feminism
dazu
if
gezwungen
young
werden,
women are
sozusagen
forced
im Prinzip das
to
zu tun, sexuelle
do things, to
Dienstleistungen
perform
ohne
sexual
Grenzen
services
letztendlich
without any
ausführen
limits
zu müssen an
on
machistischsten Männern.
machos,
Ja,
on the
das ist
most
ein
macho
überraschendes
of
Ergebnis
men.
von
That is a
Feminismus, dass
very
das jetzt in der
surprising
Praxis
take on
zigtausendfach
feminism.
stattfindet. Das muss
Thousands and
man
thousands of
klar
cases.
machen und deshalb ist es wichtig, dass wir
That's
so eine
what we need
Veranstaltung
to make
haben wie
people
hier
understand,
heute
and
und dass es
that's
Menschen
why
gibt,
today's
die
conference
sagen,
is so
ich bin
important.
dazu gezwungen
It's so
worden und ich erzähle
important that
jetzt
we
darüber,
hear
weil
people
ich glaube, dass
saying,
viele,
I was
die eben nicht so nah
forced to
dran
do
sind,
this,
sich das
and
gar nicht
I'm now telling
vorstellen
you
können. Es
about
ist nicht
it.
so, dass das
Because I
befürwortet
think
wird,
a lot of
sondern
people
es ist
don't
einfach
know what
so,
it's
dass sich
like.
viele
It's not like
kein
they
Bild davon
endorse or
machen,
don't
was
endorse
wirklich abgeht.
something.
Und das Bild in
They
der Öffentlichkeit
don't
wird
know
leider sehr
what is
stark
actually
geprägt
going on,
von
and
diesen,
the
die
public
dieses
image
andere
is very
Narrativ
much shaped by
befürworten. Das
those
müssen wir
representing the
schaffen
other
und
narrative.
das muss uns auch
And
als
that
Gesetzgeber, die es
is something
letztendlich
that as
entscheiden
legislators
können,
who have the power to make
dazu führen, dass wir die
decisions,
Mehrheiten bekommen.
it must make
Ich
us
würde es ja
win
sofort machen,
majorities.
aber wir
I
brauchen
would do it
eben die
immediately,
Mehrheit,
but we need
die sich damit
majorities
beschäftigt und zu dem Ergebnis kommen.
that
Ich bin
will
mir
deal
ganz
with
sicher, wenn
things,
wir es
and I
schaffen,
am 100%
werden wir
sure
kurz darauf auch im
once we
Rückblick
manage,
sagen, wie
then
konnten wir so lange
we
mit
will
der anderen
look back
Situation
and say,
umgehen? Wie
how
konnten wir
could
das
we
zulassen?
live with this
Und
other
manchmal
situation
gelingt
for
es
so
auch,
long? And
für
sometimes
Missstände eine Aufmerksamkeit
shortcomings
zu
or
erwerben, die genau zu
grievances
dieser Reaktion führt.
need
Wir
this
hatten
public
vor
attention
2
in
Jahren,
order
als
to get a
im
reaction.
ersten Corona-Jahr
Let
zum
me give you an example.
Beispiel
2 years ago, in the first year of the pandemic,
aufgedeckt, wie die Situation von Menschen in der
there
Fleischindustrie ist.
was the
Da gibt
case
es nämlich
of
auch teilweise
unveiling the
Situationen,
situation
dass
of
Menschen
people
aus
working in the meat
Osteuropa
industry. There was
dann
often the situation where
praktisch
people
im
from Eastern
Umfeld des
Europe
Schlachthofs dann leben, auch sehr
worked and
prekär
lived
leben
in very precarious
und da auch in einer gewissen
circumstances
Form
on or
ausgebeutet
near
werden. Und da
the
hat es
grounds of
dann
the
auch eine
slaughterhouse,
Initiative
and they were
gegeben, das zu
being
verbessern.
exploited.
Ich habe immer gesagt,
And there was an
ja,
initiative to
ist
improve their
richtig,
lives, and
aber
I kept saying, well,
schaut
that's
doch mal auf
good,
die, bei
but
denen die Ausbeutung noch
can't you
viel
look at those who
existenzieller
are
ist.
being
Also
exploited in
wieso
a much
machen
more
wir das nicht
existential
auch
manner?
hier und
Why
schauen dahin
can't
und
we
verbieten
do this
das?
here as well? Why can't
So,
we
also
say
es
no
ist
to
einerseits ein
this and
positives
issue
Beispiel, weil sich auch
prohibitions?
mal Dinge
So it's a
bewegen
positive
können,
example
wenn
in that
das
we have seen that
Ausmaß
things
des
can be
Unrechts mal
changed
wirklich auch in das
if
öffentliche
the
Licht
extent, once the
kommt.
extent of the
Also deshalb
injustice is
ist
brought
es
into the
möglich, aber
limelight. So it
es
is
hat eben
possible to have
noch
change,
nicht
but it
das Ausmaß,
seems
also nein, das Unrecht der Prostitution, was wir haben
the
in Deutschland,
injustice of
eben noch nicht unters
prostitution that we
Licht
have
gestellt.
in Germany
Und
hasn't
es
been
gibt
sufficiently brought into the
etliche,
limelight
die da
yet. And
zusammenarbeiten
there
und
are a lot of
wir
people
müssen da
working
vielleicht noch
towards
koordinierter
changing
zusammen
this. And I
vorgehen. Helmut
think
Sporer
there
ist schon benannt
needs to
worden.
be
Er ist
more
einer der
coordination.
ganz,
Helmut
ganz
Sporer was
wichtigen
mentioned before. He's
Ermittler
one
und
of the
Aufdecker und
most
Kämpfer
important investigators
in
and
diesem Themenbereich.
fighters
Bin ihm sehr,
against
sehr dankbar und ich würde auch sagen, dass
all this. I'm very
er auch
grateful to him.
mich dazu
think
gebracht hat, da anders
He was
hinzusehen
the one who also
und
made
zu sagen, das
me
kann doch alles nicht
look at
wahr
things
sein, was in
differently and
Deutschland
say, this is
stattfindet. Also wir müssen weiter
impossible, this
darüber reden, wir
cannot be
müssen das
true, the things that are
Bewusstsein
happening in
schärfen
Germany.
und an den
So we need
Mehrheiten
to continue
weiterkämpfen.
to work together and work towards gaining majorities.
Thank you so much. Helmut Sporer was a great contributor to the conference last year, actually. So we're also very much appreciative of his efforts. And just to add to what you were saying, my husband is actually German, and we have these discussions on trafficking and sex trafficking actually as well. And he's in business, and what he says that any corporation that had this homicide rate, that had broken bones, various violence and abuse, etc., would be shut down like this. So why are we still operating brothels and places where women and sometimes even children are abused, and they're open and they're considered a business and a type of work? Because in any regular business with all of this, it could not be possible. They'd be shut down with fines, people going to jail and such. And here we have it freely in our society. And before I take more questions from the audience, I would like to actually turn to you for the same question.
Thank you so much. And I think that we all can agree in here that those who are exploited by prostitution, by trafficking, are vulnerable groups in almost all of the cases, and also that it is an actual exploitation going on, and that we need to take political means to fight against it and to do it together. That's why I'm happy or glad to hear that Ms. Winkelmeier-Becker is going to fight for this also here in Germany, because I think it's a really good step. If I compare it to the situation almost 20 years ago when I was a youth politician, when the Nordic model or the Swedish law was enforced, it was quite controversial, both in Sweden but also out of an international perspective. And we can now see that it is not so controversial anymore. And I welcome very much that we have this debate here today, that we exchange experiences on how we do it in different countries, how we can learn from each other, and also can change the legislation in some countries and also in Germany. And I agree what you said before, that if Germany would take this step, that would be we would be a couple of countries that would be role models for the rest of the world. And I think that would be a really, really important step. Having that said, we we of course must admit that we have huge problems at home, even what kind of legislation we have. So when the politicians are agreeing up on that this is the problem and they have the guts to do the changes that are needed, we also must influence, of course, the population in our countries, the attitudes towards this problem, to point out that there is vulnerability in these groups that are being exploited. Still, in Sweden today, I meet many people saying, but there are people who are happy being prostitutes because they have chosen it themselves. And as from what we heard today, we know that this is not the case. So we need to start changing attitudes, and I think that is something we need to start doing early. We need to include these perspectives in the sex education, for example, in schools. There was an election in Hungary a couple of weeks ago where they had this referendum on should we include sex education and talk about LGBTQ people and so on. And the referendum was not accepted, thankfully, but still there is a majority not including sex education in many countries. And I think this perspective also must be included when it comes to sex education, and to talk about vulnerability, to talk about what is the actual case in our countries and what we can meet. Because we know that we heard from the Israeli example that 20% of all the men sometime went to a prostitute or that they exploited someone. And I think not everyone, because there are all classes, all age groups that do this, but I also know that there are also many young men who are doing this, even as young as 17, 18, 19, 20. And if we can start already in schools, we might change the attitudes from an early age and to give hope for the future when it comes to this. So that was what I wanted to say. There are, of course, many more perspectives, but yeah, thank you for now.
Thank you so much. And as we are continuing, I mean, one of the panels that we will have tomorrow is actually trafficking for the purposes of pornography production. And the fact that so many young boys actually perceive this as a norm to go and purchase other human beings for their sexual gratification. And also from the reports that we have from survivors actually participate in really violent acts it's also something that they're getting socialized by the pornography industry, actually, to say that this is okay. So that's one of the things that will be discussed also tomorrow.
Thank you. I mean, very many valid points were raised about demand and, advice for Germany. But I think if you start talking about or using demand as a lens through which, you understand human trafficking, if this narrative kind of succeeds, then I think all other political measures, revisions on the legislation and so on might come more naturally. But operationally speaking, I would really like to highlight that Germany today lacks a national referral mechanism. They have set up one, or are setting up one, as I understand, which is bilateral with Bulgaria, which is of course very good. But this is very, very necessary, operationally speaking, for authorities and organizations. And as said before, the state has the main responsibility here. So this initiative should and must come from the state. Also, I would like to add that when you introduce NRMs or national action plans against human trafficking, and I'm speaking to decision makers, please guarantee earmarked funding. Because what we see, for example, in countries that have quite successful national referral mechanisms, we see that there is a huge blockage very often with law enforcement, with the police, because while other state agencies during that process become better at identifying victims of human trafficking, they refer the cases to the police, who cannot keep up. And you have all these preliminary investigations piling up at the different police stations. So earmarked funding is the most crucial aspect in order to kind of implement the structures you're producing. As a final remark, I also want to give a compliment to Germany, because Germany also is doing more and more things when it comes to human trafficking. And I really welcome Germany setting up at the moment a national rapporteur, an independent national rapporteur, which I understand is being set up at the Institute for Human Rights. And this is very welcomed, especially in a country like Germany with different lender and quite, high local, regional administrative independence. It's important that kind of how big the problem is and that you can follow tendencies, developments, and so on. So these are my advice. Thanks.
Much for that valuable advice, and I'll jump on that advice and say that the Office for Democratic Institutions and Human Rights, as has been mentioned already, has released updated guidance on the national referral mechanism, and one of its mandates is to support OSCE participating states in developing and strengthening national referral mechanisms, and we're happy to support Germany's efforts to do so. And with that, actually, I would like to take a question from the audience. And if you could raise your hand so that the mic will come to you.
Chairwoman of Terre des Femmes, Human Rights for Women, the largest human rights organization for women in Germany. And for 6 years, we have been fighting for the establishment of the Nordic model. And in doing so, we become the object of hostility in Germany. It is not just the prostitution lobby acting somewhere in parliaments and being against. No, we are being discriminated against, threatened with hostile action. We are kicked out of alliances because we are hostile towards sex workers. Cooperations are terminated because of us being hostile towards sex workers. It is an incredibly vicious atmosphere, also in the newspapers, when they make defamatory reports on us and we give counter statements. They're often not published. Not always, but especially from the left, from so-called feminists who still see this as self-determination of women. And I think that's a terrible atmosphere, which I hope is going to change soon. And I want to mention another aspect as well. When we talk about education, then it is very, very important to address men. Let's assume that 80 to 90% of women in this business work there because they're being forced to. That means that every man who consumes, who buys sex, who buys a woman, will have to assume she does not do this voluntarily. So the men must be brought on board in the education to see, do you really want to do this? So there is an alliance called Red Lights Off that addresses the men with postcards and slogans such as "Your pleasure is my horror." But this is where society really has to rethink. And I would say changing the narrative is not putting it strongly enough. There has to be a proper rethinking in the broad society. We don't have the majority behind us yet for this model. I can only confirm this. So we are an alliance, gemeinsam gegen Menschenhandel, and not all of our members are explicitly in favor of the Nordic model. But some are not in favor of it because they have made this experience to say whoever advocates for it is excluded from other networks, from corporations. That's sadly the experience that they made. And I think it's very important to continue working towards this. Dr. Winkelmeier-Becker wrote an article in a small booklet that we published and that we provided to authorities. We have it on display here as well, and I think that will need to be the core of the discussion. And you need to understand that you will have headwind when advocating for the Nordic model. On the situation of men, it's one of the most fascinating things about the Nordic model is that the awareness of young men in Sweden and other countries has changed. For your 18th birthday, you no longer don't go to a brothel. It's not a cool thing to do anymore. You do something else. So the societal climate has changed, and there is an understanding that sex belongs in a partnership, in a relationship, and then it comes out of this moraline corner, and that it's about human dignity and about women's rights. That's important. As long as we have this notion, it's only the conservatives who say we need to be loyal to a partner. No, we need to talk about human dignity and women's rights, and if we do that, then I think we'll have a chance.
Thank you so much for those comments. I think Kevin just wanted to add a thought to what you were saying actually right now as well.
Yes, just briefly, I met with somebody who was running for office in the United States, and they were advocating for the fact that prostitution, regulated and pro-prostitution, would be a better stance. So I said to them, well, what I would ask you to do is yourself as a male, or your wife, or your children, or your sisters, why don't you get one of those to go and try it and come and speak about it? And I said, because, you know, I've gone and tried homelessness, or we may go and experience a job. Politicians very often go and look at jobs, but let's get somebody to go and experience it themselves. And they wouldn't have to go all the way or whatever, but they could have a night of somebody coming in drunk, somebody coming in who is not, you know, mentally unstable, and see what that's like, and then stand in a parliament and explain what that was like. Maybe 20 people during a night, and explain what that's like. And I will draw back on William Wilberforce, who ended slavery in the transatlantic slave trade. He made an expression: if it's not good enough for me, then it's not good enough for anyone. So let's get some politicians to go out there, experience it, then come and speak in your parliament and tell you what it's like.
Thank you so much, Kevin. I have actually a question for Luba. Actually, a couple of questions for her from the online audience. So I'll start with the first one. I'm a trained machine designer and informatics engineer, but I found my dream job in sex work. A general ban on buying sex would take away my livelihood and the right to practice my profession freely, and I would never accept that. In this case, like many of my colleagues in my home country, France, I would simply continue to work illegally. Honestly, is that the solution? Is a sex purchase ban the panacea for all problems?
So to this question, when we pass laws, we never speak about one person. Every law should be checked and considered in, we need a macro analysis. So what we have in macro analysis, in the framework with legalized prostitution, like in Germany, we have people in prostitution. Even under the Nordic model, we are not naive. We know that we can never eliminate prostitution completely, just like we cannot eliminate rape or theft or murder. So under the Nordic model, some people will still work in prostitution. So this particular individual can keep working in prostitution. Now she says, I will be forced to work illegally. But now in Germany, we refer to Helmut Spohr's report. About 60 to 90% of women work here in prostitution illegally and against their will. So this is the situation of 90 or maybe slightly less % of women under legalized prostitution. So we cannot discuss this particular individual as important as she is. We have to speak about the macro situation. So many people work illegally under legalized prostitution and under the Nordic model. But under the Nordic model, the size of prostitution shrinks because the demand shrinks, and we have less people in prostitution, including a legal one. And what is extremely important to say, that she said she's designer or engineer, sorry, I forgot. but she is not the target audience of the sex buyers. The sex buyers target very, very young and new girls. They target underage girls. We all know when they call to brothels and they call to prostitution establishments, they never say, send us your most experienced designer. They always ask, who is the youngest one and who is the new one? So they always create demand for more and more girls. And the situation, the situation is tragic. And many of those women are harmed by prostitution. Some women who are extremely harmed, they're completely dysfunctioning in the beginning of their prostitution career. They believe that prostitution is a good job for them. So Nordic model indeed is an extremely paternalistic law. Many laws are paternalistic. Universal healthcare is paternalistic. But we also have to take this into account, that many women who claim that prostitution is my dream job, they ended up ill, dysfunctioning, unstable, addicted to drugs. And that's why when we implement the macro analysis, we have to pass this law.
It is also important to note, actually, in addition to what you have said, that neither of the models actually seeks to criminalize women in prostitution. And that's something that actually is not reiterated enough. The only difference, at least in my personal view, is the fact that one seeks to criminalize the demand, the men, and the other one does not. Both seek to protect women and not criminalize women as such. But one model addresses demand and the other one does not. But with that, actually, I have another question for Luba, which is the following. Germany earns from human trafficking through tax revenues from prostitution. How can a change take place? How can Israel help us?
Okay, so according to this topic, I have already mentioned that the situation in Israel and Germany is different. Israel was never famous for its brothels, and we never had legalized brothels. And this situation where the sex trade money flows to the state coffers, which is coffers, sorry. Okay, so this is indeed challenging. So I have my answer has two parts. One is moral and the other one is more practical. So morally, yes, the sex trade, it creates money, but this money, this income, it has its price. And what is its price morally? Again, let's refer to Helmut Sporer's report. Those 60, 70, 80, maybe 90% of Eastern European, African, maybe Thai and other women who are held here in the brothels, in official brothels against their will. This is the price of this income. Many of those women have no access to the public welfare system because they are foreigners, because they are illegal, because they don't have maybe health insurance. So they pay the price for this income. So morally, I think that no income can justify this suffering of these women. And more practically, just what you can do to convince the policymakers, try to make some to make some analysis, to try to translate this harm into numbers, like what impact prostitution has, legalized sex trade has on the public health system. In the areas of prostitution, the public very often is not safe. People don't have safe. There are a lot of prostitution-related crime activities, like drug dealers usually surround the prostitution business. Very often illegal loans surround prostitution business. You know, I have interviewed for my own research, I have interviewed several dozens of survivors, and women told me that the criminals offer them illegal loans, with very high interest, and when they're not able to repay those loans, they sell them to prostitution so they can pay the loans. So there are a lot of crime around. Even legal prostitution business can have the same problem. So maybe you need to monetize the harm.
Thank you. Thank you so much. And as we have run out of time, we're just going to turn to one or two last questions before our short break.
Thank you. First of all, my first question would have been on the fact of education. So you've already covered that. Thank you very much. The other question is, I think the topic was raised about where the money goes, or the money about human trafficking in general. Could you maybe say a bit more on that, what the situation is in Germany? Maybe if there is anything towards preventing or diminishing that, and maybe on the situation in general, what the current knowledge is on that.
Kevin, would you like to answer that?
So you raise a very important area there, and there's a UN Liechtenstein initiative which talks about the money and finance and investors, for example. You know, when there's big investment being made by an investment group, how much is due diligence is done before there is supply chain checking. And there's other things that I've called for, like, for example, when migrant workers move from one place to another, and this is something we are seeing an approach with the Ukrainians, for example, but is it being properly done? Is that, say, for example, there's an enormous amount of workers go from Vietnam to Taiwan, but they don't get bank accounts. There's no bank that will give them bank accounts. So they're paid, and their remittances are sent back through, you know, ways that they pay 9% to get it back, or that they may have to have other deductions made. Whereas if they had a bank account, the money would be transferred straight into a bank account back to the family. The money would go back, and then they would get a credit rating when they eventually go home 1 or 2 years later. So we're looking at it so not in a policy-led approach, not in the way that we do finance around the world, the way that money transfers. And it was a lawyer said to me recently, when they as a firm get a notice that money may have been touched by terrorism, the company almost has to stand still, and they have to make sure that that money isn't going there anymore, or if it does, they have to report it, and they have to make sure, and they will spend a fortune on that. If they get told it's human trafficking, they go, oh, well, let's get, you know, do something on a Tuesday afternoon and get some people in and talk about it if we're not busy. So there's not the same seriousness, and the streets apart. But also things like money that's tainted. If we look at, you know, brothels have been there for years in London, I'm talking about, and they're just known as being historic brothels for decades. And of course, operations are done, sometimes about trafficking, sometimes about, you know, controlling prostitution for gain. And that ends up with the women sometimes suffering and ending up being deported sometimes even. Well, what about the people that are making the real money, the owners of these premises that are charging £300 or £400 a shift, and they've got 4, so £1,600 a day for this property? And then there's cases where these are recorded sometimes as student accommodation, or even on occasions diplomatic premises. All of this is going on, and we're not looking at it in a really serious policy-led approach like we do other serious organized crime. And the thing is, it's all there to be found out. When I was running operations, we would go and look at airline tickets. You know, we saw regular bookings of one way for women. That was something we would then focus on. That was a red flag to us. And it led to enormous operations where we ended up identifying hundreds of women who were trafficked for sexual exploitation. And the money was then going all around the world. So that's how organized this is. But the way we're looking at it now on a case-by-case process, going back to your point, we need to look at it on a macro level. We need to start finding where that 150 million is going, billion, should I say, and prevent it. And that includes within the legitimate economy, because there's a lot of businesses making money at this as well.
Thank you, Kevin. And just to be clear, sex trafficking, so from the 150 billion profit, 2/3 of it are from sex trafficking. So 99 billion a year is from sex trafficking. So this is where the money is for criminals in general. So one last final question before we take our break.
It's a very short question. I am Kate Imaswen. I run Great Africa Network for Women, working on human trafficking across Nigeria and here in Berlin. My question is very short and brief. And this is to say, what can whistleblower policy be a part of? Can it be a measure in fighting human trafficking? The whistleblower option, can it be a policy in fighting human trafficking? Because it's shrouded around secrecy and people don't talk about it. Even victims cannot really talk about who have trafficked them. So if the whistleblower policies introduced into human trafficking as a measure, can it really curb human trafficking?
I think Kevin would like to take.
I'll just give you a short. Absolutely, yes. And in some companies, that's exactly what they've done. A whistleblower policy with a safety that you're not going to be penalized in any way. And I think that that's exactly what we need. We need to be able to call it out and feel safe about calling it out. And then like the policies, and some of them have them in legislation. For example, Ireland has a disclosure legislation about if you raise something, particularly when it's involving the state, you won't be sanctioned for it if you've made a genuine error. So whistleblower policies can really encourage people, particularly in workplaces, but we do need them to consider them in areas like, women who are exploited in sexual exploitation. How do they call for help? How do they actually step out of the shadows and safely say it may not be they want to speak to police? Very often they won't want to speak to police. Who is it that can actually be the person that whistleblower will call? And really realize that it'll be safe and that it'll be properly funded and it'll be properly have resources so that people can be supported and rescued and dealt with in a very professional, trauma-informed way.
Thank you so much, Kevin. And with that, I would like to end this panel a little bit late, and thank all the panelists actually for their incredible contributions to this very critical discussion, actually, not just for Germany, but for the whole of the EU and the OSCE region as a whole. With that, we're going to take a 30-minute break. So for those that are online, please tune in or don't disconnect and stay online. We will be back in 30 minutes with a very exciting panel of survivor leaders. And I think this is something that is at the heart of all of this, and we really, really hope that you stay on and participate and listen. So we will see you back in 30 minutes from now. Thank you.